Are you nervous? I'm nervous. I'm nervous because I do this frequently, but I usually have a relationship with the people that I talk to. So this is a new group of people, and it will take a moment to get to know each other. And I'm nervous because I have to ask you to do a really radical thing. Okay, you ready? So I have a question. How do you do? It's good to know you. May we find in our togetherness honest joy. Okay, so there's a little inauthenticity there because that's not a poem, it's a song. And the song goes like this. How do you do? Good to know you. May we find in our togetherness honest joy. Thank you, Kelly Jo Phelps, who's the writer of that song. May that applause be for him. Thank you. I saw something really beautiful in Fort Worth, Texas, years ago. I saw a bunch of buttons. There were buttons on hats. There were buttons on lapels or buttons on back pockets, backpacks, pocketbooks, and they all said the same thing. The button said, the most radical thing we can do is introduce ourselves to one another. The most radical thing we can do is introduce ourselves to one another. So how do you do? It's good to know you. I'm asking you all collectively, but I don't expect us all to answer. It seems like we've forgotten who we are as one. It's like we've forgotten the words to the songs that we used to sing together, maybe particularly after January 6th of 2021. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about forgiveness. But before I do, I want you to imagine a big wide open field, beautiful wide open field filled with flowers. Okay? And I want you to imagine forgiving that entire field of flowers. Now, I don't expect that to make sense, but I just want you to imagine forgiving an entire field of flowers. Forgiveness is hard for us, so let's scale it back a little bit. I want you to imagine forgiving one single flower, or maybe even just a single petal of a flower. How many people are really comfortable with forgiveness? That's great. Forgiveness is hard for many people. Forgiveness sometimes feels like permission, or concession, or defeat. But I assure you that the way I mean forgiveness has nothing to do with those things. When I say forgiveness, I'm really talking about a special thing that, it's something that gives me energy. It's not a cost, it's a benefit, it's a victory. Okay, so what I mean by forgiveness is the agreement that I make with myself to understand what's actually happening without my reactivity and my anger getting in the way. Does that make sense? Because I get angry, I get frustrated, I get enraged, and I understand peace best. I understand beauty best when I am myself at rest. I understand the beauty of our country best when I am at rest. And I see the beauty of our country now, maybe especially now. What's the song? Oh, beautiful, our heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self our country loved, and mercy more than life. Those are my favorite words from that song. All right, let me shift a little bit. I want to tell you a little story. 9 years ago, I scored an absolutely meaningless run, and when I touched home plate, right there and then, I broke my leg. I broke my femur. Largest bone in the body. Bam! And I piled up in a clump. It was really painful. And they put me on that big blue stretcher, the hard one, the plastic one. And then they loaded me onto the boat. The boat was called the Perseverance, which I really love. And I rode the 9 miles back from where I was in the Isles of Shoals back to Portsmouth. I really like that I was on the Percy. I spent that whole time with my head cradled in the arms of a man that I had not known before. He was a white guy. He was a Christian. At the time, I did not know his name. I did not know his political orientation. I didn't know his background. But he cradled me in his arms when I was broken. So we were brothers. And we still are, and that's pretty radical. My leg has healed over the last 9 years, but our story largely has not. We have not yet learned to flower. We haven't let the beautiful part in ourselves come forth and really expand. We haven't agreed to face what's actually happening without our reactions getting in the way, but we can do this. And I believe that it takes forgiveness. We can forgive ourselves and one another, and we can forgive our story most of all. And we can do this all at once and one petal at a time. And I'd like to show you what I mean by this. One of my favorite flowers in the world is a woman named Joan Baez. She sings a beautiful song that was written by a woman named Zoe Mulford. The song is called "The President Sang Amazing Grace," and the words are these. A young man came to a house of prayer. They did not ask what brought him there. He was not friend and he was not kin, but they opened the door and they let him in. And for an hour, the stranger stayed, and he sat with them and he seemed to pray. But then the young man drew a gun and killed 9 people, old and young. In Charleston, in the month of June, the mourners gathered in a room. The president came to speak some words, and the cameras rolled, and the nation heard. But no words could say what must be said for all the living and the dead. So on that day and in that place, the president sang Amazing Grace. The president sang Amazing Grace. We argued where to lay the blame, on one man's hate or a nation's shame, some sickness of the mind and soul, and how the wounds might be made whole. But no words could say what must be said for all the living and the dead. So on that day and in that place, the president sang Amazing Grace. My president sang Amazing Grace. It might be clear what you're looking at, it might not be. But for every word of poetry, of which there are for every line of poetry, of which there are 26 lines, there's an image that's attached to that line of poetry. I want to show you my favorite lines, which are these, and they correspond to these lines of poetry. So on that day and in that place, the president sang Amazing Grace. And my favorite line of all, which is this line right here, represented by that figure, that object, which is how the wounds might be made whole. That's what I'm most interested in looking at. I want to take a sort of bird's eye view of that one petal, if you will, but start at the beginning with the first line of poetry. A young man came to a house of prayer. They did not ask what brought him there, and then go right through the song very quickly so you can see the whole thing at once as a flower. You can analyze each line of poetry along 7 different kind of categories. The sort of casual, interpersonal level, which I'm going to call the sporting level. How you doing? What's going on? It's good to see you. Nice dress. Like your glasses. Just things we say to one another normally. If we're talking to the media, it would appear as a green color. If it concerns the legal department, it would be this magenta color. These lines are, we argued where to lay the blame. That argument on one man's hate or a nation's shame, that argument is something we'll determine in the law. The straight up information, things we need to know is represented by this off-white color. And then this one I'm calling private narrative authority, or things a president or a leader of an organization would say, is the dark blue. It gets sticky when you see this sort of, when violence steps in. that violence is represented by this sort of fiery, dynamic color. So then the young man drew a gun and killed 9 people. Those are acts of violence, and they're represented by the orange color. The wisdom dimension is the highest dimension. It's just this rosy, flowery color. That's my favorite. They overlay each other, and they correspond, they overlap, so that they form a flower that you can look at from a distance, and it's kind of pretty. You can also make a pie chart out of it. If you're a geek like me, and you want to, make a mathematic equation out of a poem, that's the way I did it. But mostly it's a flower. It's the best way to see it. This line that says, how the wounds might be made whole as part of that larger system of petals, I'm going to remove that line, because the ones that I want to talk about is when he sang Amazing Grace. And he did so in a eulogy. Has anybody seen it? Are you familiar with what I'm referring to right now? In the aftermath of the Charleston shooting, the President of the United States went down to South Carolina and gave the eulogy for the Honorable Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was one of the 9 who was killed. And he sang Amazing Grace against the advice of his advisors. They were like, don't sing, but he did it anyway. That flower exists right there in a larger field. Let me tell you what I mean by field. That's the first petal in the field, and if we were to look at that, that's just the opening introductory remarks that he made. That's the basic media grounding introductions, time and place and whatnot. He began by saying something beautiful by an opening prayer, and then he went into what he was about to say, and then he goes through the whole of his speech. We'll go through very quickly. We won't have time to see it, but you've just seen his entire speech. You've seen the graphic representation of everything he said that day. And by shrinking it and putting it into a field, we can see that whole speech at one time. And we can go through that speech just as that's where the singing happens. But when you look at the whole field, we can go through the field in the same way we went through the flower. That's the sporting dimension, the media dimension to follow. This is the legal dimension. This is what he had to say that was just for your information. Here's what he had to say that was presidential narrative authority. He's the president, so he does that a lot. He enjoyed that. I remember that? It was like he loved being that. Anyway, and then here's where he was talking about violence, and that's where he was being wise. And so those petals overlap and come together in the same way the flower did, but this time as a garden, as a field. The thing that he said that I thought was, well, there's the pie chart of the fields, which shows you what a geek I am. So the dimension that I loved the most was when he talked about, he said some really important things. He asked the question, perhaps this causes us to examine what we're doing that causes our children to hate, which is a very powerful question. Putting that back into the larger field. We don't have to wonder about that question, because the shooter told us himself. Dylan Roof, who carried out the act, wrote a manifesto, and you're looking at a graphic representation of that manifesto right now. That was published, this is the manifesto that was published in the New York Times 6 days before President Obama delivered his speech in South Carolina. Most poignant thing he said was in flower, I think it's R, I can't read it from here, but what he said that I found so interesting was, it says, in the manifesto, Mr. Roof writes, the event that truly awakened me to what was the Trayvon Martin case. Dylan Roof said, I kept hearing and seeing his name, and eventually I decided to look him up. I read the Wikipedia article, and right away I was unable to see what the big deal was, and most powerfully, it was obvious that Zimmerman was right. George Zimmerman was the man who shot Trayvon Martin back in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. George Zimmerman shot an unarmed African-American man. And for some reason, Dylan Roof thinks that he was obviously right. Let's put that back into the field. The Wikipedia article that drove him to do such a thing looks like this. It's a much larger article. Now, if we take that article and we try to figure out what Dylan Roof saw in it that was so compelling, And this is not an argument in favor or in defense of Dylann Roof. It's simply an interrogation of the Wikipedia article. If we just look at the flowers that contain the word Zimmerman, or the paragraphs, each flower is a paragraph, remember. So these are the flowers, these are the paragraphs that contain the word Zimmerman. I'm going to just consolidate that field, so unify it. And then if we look at what are the petals or what are the sentences graphically represented that contain the word Zimmerman, and we get that. Now what I'm going to do is perfect these flowers, or sort of like unify the field one more time. We can ask the field of flowers, how many positive things are said about George Zimmerman? How many neutral things are said about George Zimmerman? How many negative things are said about George Zimmerman? Okay? And if we were to create a bar graph to represent that, that bar graph would look like this. With positive, the highest one, neutral in the middle, and negative beside it. Now, if we were going to ask the same, or do the same exercise for Trayvon Martin, this is what we get. We get an equal amount of negative as we do neutral, and very, very, very little positive. If we were to look at them together, I'll just widen the chart here, but I can't simply widen it, I also have to scale it, because the number of positive things about George Zimmerman won't fit on Trayvon Martin's scale. So this is what is said positively about George Zimmerman. So what's the problem with this story? I won't argue about bias. I think that's obvious and clear. But I will argue or suggest or just simply state that this story is not tough enough. It's not worthy of the beauty that was Trayvon Martin. It's not worthy of the dignity and the decency of his beloved family. What does that mean? This analysis of flower, this flower analysis, is my way of trying to deal with the kind of racial bias or cultural predisposition that sometimes eludes our eye and evades our grasp. There's a quote, I think, by a man named Robert Monks, who said that the culprits these days have no soul to save and no body to incarcerate. We can't go to the author of the Wikipedia article and say, what did you mean by this? Because it was collectively written. As an aside, if we were to go back to that article that we just analyzed, the author, the last contributing author, had a tag name called Faceless Enemy. I thought that that was ironic. And I'm sure it's only ironic, to be honest. So in order to deal with where we are right now, I think we need to do a radical forgiveness. And by radical forgiveness, I mean, like, if there's a way to get one step beyond our outrage, and just breathe into it so that we don't let our outrage push us back down into the maelstrom of facts and figures, but lets it push us upward into wisdom, I think we'll do just fine. I think that we'll remember the words to the songs that we may have forgotten. And even if we don't remember those words, we'll do just fine. I want to close with a story that was delivered to me by my teacher and my friend, Rebecca Parker. She learned it from Robert Fulghum, who's a minister in our movement as well. He used to work up in Seattle, which is where Rebecca Parker is from. She told the story, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm sure that I'm not, so pardon me, but she told the story of a little girl who was asked to sing an anthem at a public event, and she responded enthusiastically, oh yes, I'll do it. And when the moment came, she forgot the words, but that did not slow her down. She remembered the beauty, and she sang from that sense of beauty. She only sang 2 words. She sang, oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful. Would you join me? Oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful, oh beautiful. Thank you. There are good ways to see ourselves forward in these dark and dreary times. It's just that we need time enough to let ourselves flower. Thank you so much for listening.